So I'm going to start by making a few general comments about stories, and then I'm going to read just a little bit from the previous two books, and then, as Darren has said, rightly focus on my latest novel. So let's think a little bit about storytelling in general. And I was thinking about when my children were small, because I always used to wonder why, after a hard day at school, they would want to come home and then play teachers and reenact the classroom. But I eventually realised what they were doing. They were telling stories to make sense of what they'd experienced. They were using their imagination to understand and process what it was like being at school. And storytelling is something that, as far as I'm aware, is universal to every culture and every age. We use stories to understand, to entertain, to teach, to convey a particular worldview. From my perspective as a vicar, I find it personally fascinating how much the Bible is told in story. The best known stories in the Bible, of course, the parables of Jesus, but there are also, for example, there are many stories in the Old Testament which chart the rise and fall of kings and their kingdoms in ways that still move and stir us even today. And the reason I mention the Bible is not really to talk about my faith, but to make this point that no story is ever neutral. Every story is told from a certain perspective. The presuppositions of the storyteller, whether explicit or not, will affect how the tale unfolds. Those who listen or who read may or may not recognise this perspective, but a good story will always make the audience think and respond either positively or negatively to the way the story is being told. I've always been a storyteller. I am, however, profoundly grateful that my teenage creations were written before the days of the internet, and I can emphatically assure you that no trace of them ever remains. But the urge to write never really went away, and about 15 years or so ago I started to put onto paper, onto a screen, the stories that had been forming. That, of course, was a long way from getting published. It took years to find the courage to actually approach a publisher, and it was a great surprise when the story I'd written was immediately accepted. Stories are very personal to the teller, and there's an element of self-disclosure that introverts like myself find profoundly uncomfortable. It's a bit like taking off your clothes in public. So my first book was The Drumchester Diaries. This was written perhaps a more overtly Christian perspective than my subsequent novels. It tells the story of three teenagers growing up in a church context, but does not shy away from the issues of families, peer group pressure, bereavement, even pregnancy. One thing that's always interested me is the question of perspective. So over the 7 years of the diaries, different narrators recount different years until they all come together in the 7th year. I am not going to read anything from the book, except for a short poem written by one of the central characters facing the loss of his grandmother. It's called Parting Gifts. The time has come for me to say goodbye, that little word I'll never say again. I cannot rightly tell what lies ahead, but these three things, faith, hope, and love, remain. Sometimes to live means that we must lose, and nothing I can do will ease your pain. My time on earth has run at last its course, but these three things, faith, hope, and love, remain. A day shall come when we will understand, and you and I no longer need explain. But till then, when all our tears are wiped away, these three things, faith, hope, and love, remain. By the way, in case you're wondering about the title, Drumchester is the county town of a fictional county called Drumshire, which is very much inspired by my childhood in East Devon. It can always be hard to create a fictional world in a real world location, and there'll always be awkward overlaps and points of tensions. Just ask Richard Osman, who was widely berated for placing a Waitrose in Tunbridge Wells. To some people, this sort of thing really matters. Drumshire forms the backdrop for all my writing, but with the publication of From Whom No Secrets Are Hidden, I deliberately took a new direction in my writing as I started what I hope will be a series of crime novels, and the third is slowly under production. Why did I take this direction? One thing I've noticed from watching a lot of detective dramas is how often the lead investigator has virtually next to no family. Think Morse, for example, or Vera. The victim of the crime also so often has virtually no next of kin. But I wanted to write stories where the central characters were part of a bigger story, with fathers, mothers, lovers, brothers, sisters, and children. Part of my motivation stems from my belief that, contrary to the spirit of the age, identity is to a large part formed by our relationships. And I wanted to show how identity is also moulded by our beliefs and the ways we seek to make sense of the world. So there is a faith perspective in these books. Most of the time it is subtle and understated, and it does not shy away from the sometimes harsh realities we all encounter. So here then is DS Adam Pennyquick come and his girlfriend Sadie Quick. I think you can guess where the names come from. But rather than talk further about them, I'm going to introduce them by reading the start of the first novel, From Whom No Secrets Are Hidden. The cold November deluge hit Adam in the face as soon as he came out of the courtroom. Usually he would have checked the weather forecast well in advance and taken appropriate measures. But today he hadn't, and today he didn't mind. He stood quite still for a moment, feeling the rain soak through his hair, then his jacket, and then down his back, as if ritually cleansing himself on the first day of the trial. Adam had always accepted he was part of his job to attend court, and in the normal course of events it was a task he undertook with reasonable equilibrium. But this trial was different for all kinds of reasons, and Adam knew just how much he was personally invested in the outcome. The accused had sat quite still behind the perspex screen all day, with barely a flicker of motion, not even when the mother of the victim broke down while the evidence was presented in full forensic detail. He remained steadfastly unmoved, his head slightly bowed, his keen blue eyes focused resolutely on some point a little way ahead of him. Only at the very end of the proceedings did he turn and face Adam directly, as if issuing some kind of challenge. Was that smirk behind his face mask, or sardonic smile? It was hard to tell. All Adam knew was that the old man in him wanted to rip that mask off and punch him hard, while the new man whispered something about the fruit of the spirit being self-control. Conscious of how wet and cold he was, Adam found shelter in a nearby coffee shop. Later he would go out to his sister Sally in Harold Hill, but right at this moment the bustle of a chaotic family life was the last thing he needed. He ordered a double-shot espresso and checked his messages. He ignored nearly every one of them until he found the one he wanted to read, from his fiancée Sadie. They had planned to marry back in June, but coronavirus had disrupted their plans, as for so many others, and Adam missed her terribly. Still, he had spent much of the last few years waiting for her, and the reason that sooner or later the waiting had to be over. So taking a sip of his espresso and checking he really was on his own, Adam clicked on her email and began to read. How did today go? I've been thinking of you and praying so much today. I'm very aware you can't share any details, but I hope you know you're always in my heart. I have some good news. Yesterday I managed to walk to the corner shop without stopping on the way. And today I actually managed an hour on the computer without the usual brain fog. So slowly I'm recovering, and I fully intend to come to you as soon as this trial is over. How soon can we get married? I am determined nothing stops us this time. P.S. I noticed this article in the London News. I thought you might be interested. Adam smiled as he absorbed her words. After a hard-crawled summer, it was good to see Sadie getting some of her drive back, and the prospect of a wedding would at least provide some measure of distraction during this awful trial. He would ring later that evening, but they had already long agreed that if restrictions meant only they and a few others could be there, they would still tie the knots. Adam had finished his cup before he remembered the attachment. It was a very prosaic article about our long overdue redevelopment. Yet when he read it, he found himself laughing out loud, not because the words were funny, but because once again these three strands of his life were interweaving. Somewhere, he felt, the Lord was showing again a grim sense of humour. As you can probably guess, there is more to this story than just simply Adam and Sadie getting married. He ends up inheriting a property from a great uncle called David Pennicombe, and he discovers a family he never really knew he had. He also gets caught up in the real-life crime scene when he inherits his great uncle's house, all the while investigating a drugs ring in his present job in London. To find out more, well, you'll just have to read the book. As you imagine, by the time we reach my latest novel, The Hearts of the Fathers, Adam and Sadie are married and they moved into David Pennicombe's house out in the Drumshire countryside, Little Netherworthy Lodge. However, the story doesn't start with them, but with someone born many decades earlier in an unnamed market town in Yorkshire. Granny, what's a bastard? My grandmother was baking biscuits in the kitchen as I arrived home from school, still hot and breathless. She did not say a word but held me in the folds of her gingham apron, which as I remember smelt faintly of cocoa and ginger. I was 7 years old. I was born Samuel Newley on the 1st of April 1950. The registrar clearly did not approve of the circumstances in which I was born. In place of my father's name, he drew a thick and full black line as the space permitted. As for my name, Samuel, no one could tell me where it came from. Later on, I learnt it meant the Lord has heard, which struck me as deeply ironic, since those closest to him generally saw me as best a deviation from the norm, and at worst an abomination. One family story passed down to me was that on first inquiry, the local vicar refused to christen me. But eventually he relented and passed the odious task over to a freshly minted curate, with strict instructions to conduct the ceremony as swiftly as possible between the afternoon services. However, another black line on the baptism certificate made my status clear and only served to underscore the illegitimacy of my birth. At that time, many babies of unwed mothers were given up for adoption, never to meet their natural families again. But my grandfather was a fighter, and in defiance to convention made sure this injustice never befell me. To this day I remain in his debt. Grandpa had served for 4 years on the Western Front and in Palestine, and he won 2 medals for bravery for actions he never talked about, at least while he was conscious. When he returned home after the Great War, he found his first wife and their daughter had died of influenza. He returned to the family farm in a remote corner of the Yorkshire Dales, only to find there was no work in the great agricultural depression of that period. So Grandpa Jack moved to the nearest market town, where he earned a meagre living from a variety of menial jobs, until he met and married the local greengrocer's daughter. Within a year, Grandma Edith's father died unexpectedly, and he found himself running the business. Grandpa Jack was a gentle, kind-hearted giant of a man who sought to live at peace with everyone. But despite his good nature, he lived with one perpetual fear, namely that of sleep. When he could no longer fight to stay awake, he would have the most terrible nightmares that would cause him to wake screaming or quietly weeping. So he kept himself active by throwing all his energies into the shop he had taken on. He would leave while it was still dark to collect fruit and vegetables from the local market, or take deliveries from the farmers thereabouts. Gradually, as a result of his labour, the shop began to thrive, until it became a large general store known for miles around for its quality of service and its fair prices. Because of his war wounds, Grandpa was told he was unlikely to have any children. So it was a particularly great delight when my mother Joy was born in a heatwave at the end of August 1930. Some said she was spoiled as an only, unexpected child. Others said she was a free spirit who could not be tamed. Other ways she caused much rumour and much consternation in the town when she was found to be with child. And even when I was growing up, there were older folk who remembered her as a fallen woman, a terrible example to all those tempted to lose their virtue. No doubt my mother would have told me about my father when I was old enough, but she died suddenly and unexpectedly of pneumonia when I was 5. One week she developed, as was thought, a heavy cold. The next she found herself unable to breathe, and though Dr. McDermott was sent for, no treatment proved of any avail. Sadly, I have no real memories of her, except the stories my grandparents told me, and the photos on the parlour table. She was striking rather than pretty, a long face with high cheekbones I did not inherit, and a shock of curly black hair, which I definitely owned for myself. So I went to school both a bastard and an orphan. I was never the tallest or the strongest in my class, and even though I could run fast, really fast, I could never completely escape the bullies in the playground or just outside the school gates. Most teachers ignored their misdemeanours. A few condescended to show pity, but no one took any real action. It was considered poor form in those days to tell your enemies, so I comforted myself in tales of far-off lands where good always won through and every injustice was eventually righted. Sam is a man haunted by his losses and his absent father. After his grandmother is run over and killed, he finds himself in Cheltenham renting a basement flat from a music teacher called Mrs. Prendergast, who introduces him to her circle. Sam still finds it hard to trust anyone, but circumstances lead him to form a friendship with a shy young lady, Judith Emily Smallman, who is haunted by her father for very different reasons. Let's meet him. Mr. Robert Smallman was seated at the far end of the dining room, a squat, bull-necked individual who examined me with an air of disapproval. I sat down, daring to meet his cold, hard gaze directly, and it was then I noticed his jet black hair and pencil moustache had been dyed, revealing a vanity which belied his military demeanour. "So you're the fellow who's stepping up my daughter, eh?" I consider Judith a friend. In this house, I decide who may be Judith's friends. At this point, his wife and daughter entered with a full roast beef dinner. Mr. Smallman's face lit up while Judith sullenly served him, and then he told me to tuck in. As I helped myself, Judith looked at me with an expression of near desperation. There was no question of me being the honoured guest here. I was far more a defendant on trial. As I suspected, Mr. Smallman began the conversation by talking about himself, how his parents had worked themselves out of poverty in the Forest of Dean, how he joined up after the war and was eventually promoted to Sergeant Major. Along the way, he talked about his very minor part in the coronation, his prowess in the boxing ring and Winston Churchill's funeral. When they kept on talking, I glanced at his family, Clara and Judith. It was clear they'd heard it all before. They ate quietly, head down at their plates. It was a pitiful, depressing sight. As Mr. Smallman scraped the last vegetables from his plates, he began to talk about his post-army career, how he found a position at a minor public school nearby and worked his way up to Bursar, all the while acting as drill sergeant for the cadet force. It was working hard to impress. All I could think about, however, were terrified schoolboys cowering at his commands. The dishes were cleared away and a sherry trifle brought in. Then inevitably the conversation turned to me, and I knew exactly how it would run. "Tell me about your parents," he said, oblivious to the spot of cream on his moustache. I never knew my father or my mother, and my mother died when I was 5, I replied in a flat, neutral tone. So a bastard and an orphan, he harumphed. Robert, interjected Clara, laying her hand on his. He shook her off angrily as if swatting a fly. Yes, I'm a bastard and an orphan. I looked full in his dark, scowling eyes and I loathed him. It was clear he did not react well to my defiance. And are you a bookkeeper? I nodded. That is an honest trade, I suppose. So have you ever served in the military? He continued. Judith glanced at me nervously. No, I was raised by my grandfather who saw the full horror of war. I do not believe armed conflict, although sometimes necessary, ever achieves its goals. So a bastard, an orphan and a hippie, Mr. Smallman sounded almost triumphant in his goading. I did not dignify that remark. Something about turning the other cheek came to mind, but I saw Judith silently weeping and I felt compelled to respond. Did you ever see action during your military career? Get out of my house, roared Mr. Smallman, the veins in his neck bulging. Judith rushed out of the room. I made a more dignified exit, complimenting Mrs. Smallman on her excellent trifle. That afternoon, as I lay in the cool of my basement, I realised I faced a decision. Up till now, I had always run from any threats and had moved on as a restless nomad from place to place. Objectively, there was very little to keep me in Cheltenham, but should I let Mr. Smallman dictate my step? On the other hand, I would still keep bumping into his daughter, and any encounter from now on had the potential to be very awkward. Would there be any way of maintaining our friendship? And did I need this friendship anyway? The first half of the book tells the story, therefore, of how Sam and Emily, who prefers that name to Judith, learn to trust each other and build a life together. But the spectre of Sam's father never really goes away. And in case you're wondering where the book cover comes from, it relates to a dream Sam has just a few weeks before their wedding night. That night, the sleep flurries coalesced into a bitter storm which blew throughout the hours of darkness, shaking the sash windows and howling down the chimney. I fell into a fitful, troubled sleep, and as I tossed and turned, I dreamt vivid, confused dreams in which each scene followed incoherently after the other. One was apparently of my mother, although she looked very differently from any photograph I possessed of her. We were at a crowded railway station where a black, smoky steam train was waiting impatiently for its passengers. As she boarded her carriage, she turned round for an instant to say goodbye and whispered a name, the name of my father. I wanted to reply, but by now the whistle had sounded and the door slammed shut. In my dreams that name was clear and obvious, but when I woke it had slipped from my memory, no matter how hard I tried to remember. At work that day, it took me twice as long to add up a column of numbers, and when I saw Emily that evening, she somehow could tell my thoughts were elsewhere. I was embarrassed and reluctant to share what I had seen, but in the end I told her. Maybe your mother will reappear one night and tell you again was her only suggestion, but she never came back in spite of all my prayers. Once again on my marriage certificate there would be the same black line that dogged me all my life, and I began to chide myself that I expected any difference. By now Emily was well aware of my tendency to brood, and she pointed out at least I had family coming to the wedding. Indeed it was so. The first time in many a long year, Marjorie and Donald were leaving the valley and trusting the farm to his wife Audrey. Donald was to be my best man, Marjorie my witness. In return, I spent the day before the wedding introducing them to the Langdene estate, where they ended up in long discussion with one of the contractors about Yorkshire and Cotswold dry stone walls. The day itself was raw and chilly, which was only to be expected at the start of February. When I arrived, unbeknown to me, Mrs. Prendergast and Mary were already there, rehearsing with the church music group. The vicar and the church warden were deep in conversation, appraising the new heating system, while a couple of flower arrangers were finalising displays by the communion table. I felt strangely detached from all this activity. All I could do was watch and wait as the minutes on my watch slowly ticked by. Gradually the few guests arrived, church members who had supported us in so many ways over the past couple of years, fellow librarians and colleagues from the Langdene estate. Then Mrs. Prendergast broke into Cesar Frogg's pastorale, and Emily rather nervously made her entrance, leaning on Oscar for support. Despite instructions to the contrary, I could not help turning round, and Emily smiled at me shyly. She was wearing a high-waisted, close-fitting dress that emphasised the contours of her body and her long, supple limbs, while her hair was plaited in a crown braid that revealed the graceful profile of her bare, pale neck. I gave her a brief kiss as she came up next to me. She held my hand as tightly as when we first arrived that night at Yelena's concert. The service itself proceeded smoothly and uneventfully. Reverend Rounds had conducted many marriage services in his time, and he did his best to calm our obvious nerves. He had just finished his address and invited us to make our vows, when the door at the back of the church opened slightly, and an anxious, apologetic figure slipped into the back pew. It was Emily's mother, Clara, and she was holding a small suitcase, exactly like the one Emily was carrying when she knocked on her basement sounds. For a moment there was no other sound than Clara trying to sit down as quietly as possible. Then Emily forgot herself and rushed down the aisle towards her mother, who met her with a long, tearful embrace. But unlike the church in my youth, there were no disapproving glances or audible tuts at this seeming impropriety. On the contrary, sensing the importance of this moment, Mary began to improvise a simple tune on her cello and kept on playing until Emily finally stood up, dried her eyes, and led her mother firmly to the front pew next to Mrs. Round. Clara looked terrified by her promotion, but Reverend Round simply welcomed her as an honoured guest and thanked you for coming. Then the service resumed, and as Emily and I made our vows, I caught the look of defiance on her face, and in that moment I understood. We were standing together before God and against our enemies, and we were now pledging to help each other overcome whatever challenges lay ahead, no matter how great the odds. Precisely what that commitment signified, we could not in that moment tell. But as the years went by, it was those vows that, in spite of everything, still kept us together. So will Sam ever discover his father's real identity? Let's wind forward many years to when Sam is lying in a hospital bed and reads of a grim discovery at Little Netherworthy Lodge. In the hospital, as I slowly recovered from an emergency operation, there was very little I could do or felt like doing. So I became a news junkie, watching the rolling news from almost first thing till late at night. Sometimes I got bored by the constant repetition. Sometimes a particular story grabbed my imagination. There was, for example, the body discovered just over the border in Drumshire. A certain D.S. Adam Pennicombe had inherited a house from his great-uncle David, and the remains of one Timmy Taylor had been found under the patio. The chief suspect was a certain Billy Hurst, although in my rather muddled state I couldn't quite piece it together. But that name Pennicombe, it rang a bell. I racked my memories, but try as I might, nothing came to mind. That night I went to sleep rather frustrated at my growing inability to remember names. I began to dream fitfully through a series of muddled, incoherent pictures, till eventually I found myself replaying the dream I had of my mother just before my wedding. There was the same black steam engine about to leave. There was my mother hurrying to board the carriage. There was that one hurried goodbye and the name she was whispering to me. And at that point I suddenly woke up. I now had absolute clarity what that name was. It was David Pennicombe, and he was my father. And with a mixture of elation and deep, deep grief, I began to sob uncontrollably until the duty nurse asked what was the matter. A bad dream, I replied, not wishing to divulge any part of my secrets to a stranger. I told the story to my family when they came to visit the next day. "Are you glad you know now?" asked Emily, gently holding my hands. "Yes," I said thoughtfully. But also I think a little scared about what I might find out, and if I'm honest, also rather perplexed. D.S. Adam Pennicombe is a detective, and I presume he wants rather more proof of my story than a dream. So how on earth do we provide him with the evidence? We trawled through the internet, tracked down every local newspaper report, every snippet of information from the summer of 1949, and we don't stop until we find the one smoking gun, replied Meg. Mum used to be a librarian, I am a family lawyer, and will use all our know-how to get a result. Is that a promise? What do you think, Meg replied, kissing me on the top of the head. And then the physios came and the visit came to an end. That is how over lockdown the three of us spent hour after hour glued to our screens, searching and scrolling, making notes and comparing them over strong cups of coffee. Actually finding David Pennicombe was not an issue. We could prove with absolute certainty he was undertaking basic army training no more than 8 miles away from where my mother was living. With rather more digging, we were able to find his picture, and we were shocked that Fred was almost his spitting image. But could we place David with joy? And why was there a black line on my birth certificate? We scoured every local newspaper report until we were familiar with every court case, no matter how trivial the offence, every sale at the weekly market, every advertisement placed in the classifieds. But nothing. Grandpa Jack's grocery business was mentioned several times, and there was a picture of the shop that brought back warm if hazy memories. Yet still we hit a dead end. For several days we abandoned our search, and then Molly brought home COVID, which sets us back a few weeks, and then Meg had a breakthrough. It was a picture of a dinner dance at the Royal British Legion. I had seen it already in my journey through the local press, but Meg's eyesight is far better than mine and she's able to focus for longer. There were a number of the local girls sitting at the table in their best frocks, all dressed up for the evening's entertainments, with a variety of lads standing behind them. It was not a large photo, and the quality was poor, but there unmistakably was my mother Joy right on the edge of the picture, and above her, just coming into the picture, was a very young David Pennicombe. To be sure, we could never have proof David Pennicombe actually fathered me, but in Meg's own words, the evidence was at least admissible. We printed off the picture, and with the help of a magnifying glass, I spent a long time studying it. Was that a hand gently placed on my mother's shoulder? Was she leaning back ever so closely? Or was I seeing things that I wanted to see? Some sign this was a loving relationship rather than a casual fling. But if it was, surely David's name would have appeared on the birth certificate. Maybe there would even have been a wedding. After all, he was posted to Austria a full year after I was born. Did my mother never tell him? Or was he playing callous? I tried to discuss all this with Emily, but she rightly pointed out I was torturing myself with questions I could not answer. If anyone could provide any more information, it was D.S. Adam Pennicombe, and he was the person I should be writing to. In my head, I knew she was right. I knew I needed to make contact, to confirm the substance of my dream, to establish my identity once and for all beyond any doubts. Yet months, then years rolled by, and although I made several attempts, I never finished my letter. There was a truth I was afraid of discovering, and old scars that threatened once again to become fresh wounds. So I delayed and delayed, concentrating instead on the transfer of the farm to Meg, and our fast-growing inquisitive grandchild called Molly. Then the other week, Emily discovered she was dying. For some months she'd been complaining of back pain, but she was assured it was just a muscular strain that would ease with time. But gradually started to lose weight and become more breathless. And after several counselled appointments and many frustrating phone calls, She finally had the scan which revealed tumours in her spine and lungs. I was with Emily when she received the news. For a long time I held my wife for 45 years in absolute silence, and indeed there was no need for words. We were one person joined in holy matrimony, and a gentle touch, the clasp of hands, the warmth of cheek touching cheek, communicated all we felt at that point. Eventually, however, Emily sat upright, looked at me and said, "I am not afraid of dying. I know whom I believed. I have fought the good fight. I have kept the faith. But Sam, you must promise me this, that before I go, you must find out who you are. You owe it to yourself for all that lies ahead." I nodded because that was the conclusion I'd already reached in that long, lingering silence. So as soon as I got home, I set down the words I'd been carrying for so long in my mind. And although I read and reread the letter before me a dozen times, I found that nonetheless I could not improve my initial draft. I waited until evening, but as no fresh inspiration came, I folded it into an envelope and offered a silent, heartfelt prayer. "I'm going to the post box," I announced. "I'm coming with you," said Emily. Outside, a late April sun was already setting fast. In its golden light, we walked hand in hand to the top of the farm into the woodlands, where the first new foliage of spring was bursting forth upon the ancient boughs. All the while it was slow going, as Emily had to pause for breath a couple of times, leaning on my shoulder for support. But we were in absolutely no hurry. The last rays of sunshine slanting through the trees flicked out the bluebells marking our way. And there was the tang of garlic in the air, mixed with a familiar reassuring smell of wood smoke drifting from a field beyond. Avoiding muddy puddles, a standing joke between us, we at last reached the far gate which opened out onto the narrow way. By now the sky had turned a deep blood red, and a faint mist was just starting to rise. Emily drew closer for warmth, and we completed our journey arm in arm, silently sharing a lifetime of precious memories. Then we paused and looked up at the final splendour of the day, and in that moment I suddenly and inexplicably had the assurance that in spite of everything, all was well, and all would be well. "Let's go home," Emily said. I agree. I only hope that Dies ad impedicum will write back in time. As you might imagine, when Dies ad impedicum receives the letter, he's in the middle of the case. The victim is a certain Billy Jones, formerly known as William Montague Jones, a financial wizard who disappeared with his client's assets several years previously. The chief suspect is a certain George Masters, who has written a self-help book on how to beat gambling addiction. They, together with a penniless artist called Sebastian Monk, were dumped at another minor public school by their parents 50 years ago. So why would George kill such an old friend? This is Adam reading an extract from George's book. Adam settled down in his favourite chair in the front room and began to read. It was the summer of 2015. My marriage had failed, my business was on the point of bankruptcy. I was a gambler and lost everything, including my self-respect. And then suddenly Lady Luck turned on me. I won enough to clear my debts, to make a fresh start, to finally be free. But was I happy? Only for a moment. As the reality sank in, my first reaction was to blow my winnings on another bet. But then I found my phone was out of credit. I went out to the car to drive to the bookmaker and found DVLA had clamped it. I remember breaking down on the pavement and crying my eyes out. I was desperate for the next fix, the next surge of adrenaline, and the chance I might once again be a winner. Somehow I made it into the house which, needless to say, was about to be repossessed. As I wondered what to do next, a picture came into my mind. I was alone in the desert, which just about summed up my life right at that moment. Gambling offered a way out of the desert, an escape from the boredom and the confusion of my everyday life. It was, however, only a mirage on the horizon, and no matter how much I kept chasing it, I would always stay out of reach. What I needed was a better way of surviving, a better way of making use of the resources I already had. That picture forms the basis of this book. I've met many fellow travellers in the desert, encouraged by the too good to be true offers and the slick marketing of the big companies, to always aim for the mirage. In this book, I've used my experience and theirs to show anyone caught up in addiction there is a better way and to help them find their oasis. Intrigued, Adam read on. What George wrote made a great deal of sense, even if there were far too many references to his subscription and YouTube channel and other marketing. But at the same time, Adam found himself frustrated by any further biographical information or any further mention of his own personal addiction. How had George ended up an addict? And was any of this relevant to the case? It was by now nearly midnight, and Adam could hear the questions growing louder in his mind. He was only halfway through the book, but if he was to sleep, he needed to clear his head. So, taking great care not to wake Sadie, he changed into his running gear and set off. Sometimes Adam questioned why he was living in the middle of nowhere, and then a night like this reminded him of the answer. The storm clouds had rolled by, and a full moon was emerging from a bank of heavy cloud. The lanes were still wet underfoot, but there was an exhilarating freshness in the air. Somewhere close by an owl called, and Adam caught the silhouette of its mate responding to that call. Further on, a fox hurried into the undergrowth, and he started the deer with a soft, rhythmic tread of his feet. And after about 45 minutes, and with his chest pounding, Adam turned round and headed home, aware of nothing else except the sound of his breathing and the awesome vastness of the world around him. He showered briefly and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He was woken the next morning by Sadie bringing him a cup of coffee. As she bent over and he became aware of her presence next to him, he rather regretted she was already fully dressed. She kissed him on the forehead and said, "Don't forget we have visitors later." Then she spotted the book on Adam's bedside table and asked if it was any good. Adam sat up and took a moment to regain consciousness. It's not bad, I suppose, stifling a yawn, but like many self-help books, there's no mention of a higher power or anything like that. I can't see how you will ever really break free by your own efforts. Later on that evening, Adam finished George Master's book. He was still looking for any more personal information, any more insights into the mind of a suspected killer, but all he had were a few scraps of information from the introduction. He realised as he finished the last page, something about those words were niggling away at him, but initially he could not work out why. It was only later, after Sadie had settled into his arms, that a thought occurred to him. It was at this stage unprovable, but if it was anywhere near the truth, it might at least start to explain what happened on the beach at Bindon St. Michael. He tenderly kissed the top of Sadie's head as she began to nod off, and then he turned off the lights, content that at last the pieces of jigsaw were slowly but surely starting to all come together. So while that's going on, Adam is at the same time worried about his own father, who unusually has not been in touch. Not, that is, until the investigation is about to conclude. And this is the last extract. Adam stepped out into the corridor and hesitated for a moment whether to answer. For a moment the phone stopped ringing, but then it rang again. With a sigh, Adam took the call. "Son," said his father Trevor in an unusually weary voice, "can you pick me up from Birmingham Airport?" "I'm sorry, what?" "I'm about to conclude a major investigation and you want me to drop everything to pick you up?" "I wouldn't ask, but I literally have no money. I'm stuck here." So how did you fly from Spain? I sold my golf clubs. It was at this point in the conversation that Adam began to consider his father might be telling the truth. Trevor, after all, had only two hobbies in life, women and golf. And when in his own words the pursuit of the fairer sex was put on hold, there was no place he would rather be than out on the fairways, meticulously planning for the next shot, and then aiming, not always that successfully, to put that plan into action. I can't help you tonight, said Adam bluntly, but I can book you a hotel and breakfast. I may be able to fetch you tomorrow morning. I knew you'd think of something. Has my dad ever thanked me for anything, wondered Adam as he made the reservation. He went back into the office just as Holly and Peter were picking up their bags and he motioned for them to stop. Sorry, said Adam, I have to change our plans for tomorrow. My father needs to be picked up from Birmingham Airport, don't ask. So it would make sense for me to interview, promised Emmanuel. Is that all right with you, Peter? Yes, Gov. What would you like me to do? Make sure you have the strongest possible case against Sebastian Monk and Gregory Masters. When it is confirmed Mr. Monk was driving the van, you need to pick him up. And talk to uniform, that van stank of weed, and everything points to Stephen Ford being the dealer. But let's not get sidetracked by that. Holly has arranged to go to the school. If George Masters has a ring with the school logo, they'll run our theory past forensic. Was it the ring that left a mark on Billy's nose? We really can't afford to have the CPS chuck the case back at us. Peter and Holly both nodded, and Adam followed them out of the door, aware he was about to have a difficult conversation with Sadie. Good evening, said Sadie as Adam walked through the door. I thought you'd be working late tonight. Are you hungry? There's a chicken stew I made earlier that's still hot. I am, and it's good to see you, said Adam, giving her a kiss. No, I wasn't planning to be home early, but there's something we need to discuss. Give me a few minutes and we'll talk over dinner. Sadie looked at her husband quizzically as he sat down at the table. Even now there were times when she could not always read him, and she still had no idea what they had to talk about so urgently. She watched as Adam began eating, waiting for him to say something, and then he told her about the phone call. Oh, said Sadie, who generally had little time for her father-in-law. Well, he can't stay here. How can I work here with him in the house? And what about the days when I'm ill? Believe me, I've already thought about that, replied Adam. But if he really has no money, where can he stay? I could ask Joe, I suppose. No, don't do that, Ho, replied Sadie firmly. Ever since she had found Joe passed out, she felt protective towards her, and the last thing her sister-in-law needed was her father sharing her space. So what do we do? Asked Adam, putting down his spoon and looking straight at her. I'm glad you said we, Sadie said eventually, for now I guess he has to live here, but he needs some strict rules, and if he breaks them, it's a tent in the garden. My father hates camping, said Adam, smiling. I'll buy one to let him know we're serious. Right then, what are the rules? Adam found his father the next morning at the airport hotel, trying to chat up the hotel receptionist. You're nearly 60 and she's not interested, he said sternly on the way to the car. I know, replied Trevor miserably, but I was bored. My phone credit ran out and I didn't know what else to do. You really are broke, aren't you? Said Adam, opening the tailgate of his car. I guess women were involved. The lovely Fernandez sisters, replied Trevor, putting his holdall into the boot. I saw an investment opportunity. They saw an old fool willing to part with his details, so here I am. Spare me the details, said Adam, I don't want to know. But you need to understand you're only staying with us if you follow the rules, our rules. Otherwise you're out on your own, and don't ask Jo, it's not fair on her. After all I've done for you, protested Trevor, as he stopped by the passenger door and turned on his son. Look, I have no time for a blazing row. Some of us have a job to do, and I have to be in Coventry by 12 o'clock. Either get in and take your bag with you. It's your choice. Trevor hesitated for a moment, reflecting on the weaknesses of his position. Then he got in with a silent rage etched across his face. Adam ignored him. If the Adam first Adam Pennicombe novel is about family secrets. The second hones in specifically on the relationships we have with our fathers for good and for ill. And maybe here lies the purpose of crime fiction. It is by definition the investigation of something that happens in the past that impacts the present. And I would suggest that wisdom is found when we understand the past and how it shapes the present. And I would add how ultimately in God's economy everything fits together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.